have hit record, and we're going to get started a little early, so we should be able to get out a little earlier, depending upon how much your instructor expounds today. So we got just a little bit to finish up in chapter 2, and then we'll start chapter 3. We'll be beginning with the section that starts at the bottom of page 49 if you want to kind of follow along, because you can underline or highlight areas that will be on the test, which is open book once again. So just prepping yourself to ace this test. And you guys wouldn't believe that sometimes people get D's and C's on a take-home test. Occasionally there'll be an F, but this should be an easy A for everybody. You might be asking, why do I do open book tests? Well, I figure that once you get out of school and you get a job, and if you have some kind of a problem, you're going to be able to consult your sources of information. You're not going to have to try to remember what did Instructor Bing say about that? I wished I would have really memorized that better. No, you'll be able to consult your manuals and books. And so I want you guys to learn the information, not just memorize it and spit it back out. So we finished Wednesday's class with a discussion about the Constitution setting up a system in which both the state and the national government have powers. Some powers are only reserved for the federal government. Some powers are only reserved for the state. And then they share some common powers, like taxation. And then ultimately, the Constitution, the federal Constitution, is the supreme law of the land. We'll look at that from a different angle again here in a little bit, but we want to talk about our government being a representative government. Now, our government is not a direct democracy, which would be majority rules. An undiluted democracy is simply where the mob that is in power and has the majority calls the shots. And people who are in the minority can be taken advantage of. Well, as we've been studying, we know by now that liberty, and especially individual liberty, is very, very important to American citizens, because the British King George, had continually stomped on their rights and really didn't even consider their desires and their concerns and their freedoms. So we want to have liberty, and a thing about being, and this is on the bottom of page 49, in order to have a representative government, there must be individual liberty. People need to be able to express themselves freely. But on the other hand, if you have some restrictions on the people, the majority, that is in a sense a denial of its right to govern the society as they see fit. So representative government is one where there is not, it keeps there from being a pure democracy where the mob will rule. The founders considered it to be the democracy and mobocracy were basically synonyms. And so they put forward a representative government where citizens still have the liberty to elect, but they will elect people to represent their interests. And so what this will do was it will also protect the liberties of those in the minority. So individual liberty is elevated just a little bit, I would say, above individual liberty of all citizens is more important than just the individual liberties of the majority. Because certainly, and it's happened in history, the majority in rule will take advantage of the minority. So here's some more things. Here's a little chart that shows differences between a pure democracy and a republic. We are a republic, the United States of America. We are not a direct democracy. We are a republic. So you can see, along with protecting individual rights, a republic protects property rights. That's why if any of you keep up with the news, when depending on which viewpoint, if it's usually a Democrat official or a news organization that tends to lean to the left, to Democrats, they will talk about the peaceful protesters. And a lot of times they'll have a reporter, on site, and there's a building in the background that's burning, and he's talking about these people here are peaceful protesters while they're destroying property. If you listen to a Republican representative and any news organization that leans to the right, they're going to talk about these protesters are breaking the law. They're vandalizing property. They're destroying people's businesses. And so that shows more of what we believe to be, well, what is more of a republic. A republic is more ideal for a larger population that is made up of more diversity, which that's the United States of America. different ethnic groups, different social classes. The goal of a republic is to avoid extremes. One extreme would be where the majority of the people are ruling like a mob. The other extreme is where a few government leaders become tyrannical, like King George and the Parliament of England. A democracy will usually end up with violence and disorder. So any questions on those differences? You'll want to make sure you read about how we limited popular rule. Bottom of page 50 and the beginning of page 51. One of the key things that our founders did, and you'll hear a lot about this as we come up to the November elections, but our founders established an electoral college for electing a president. What the electoral college does is it allows states to choose, actually I should say state governments, to choose electoral voters. And the electoral voters in the electoral college is a mirror of how many representatives each state gets for the House of Representatives. So for example, Oklahoma, we have 6 US representatives. And I won't ask you to name them because I can't name all 6 of them. I know that our representative in our area is Mark Wayne Mullen. But so just as we get 6 US reps, we also get to pick 6 electoral voters. And then what those 6 voters do is on election night, they will see how Oklahoma votes. So if we go back to 2016, for example, Oklahoma elected, the popular vote in Oklahoma was for Trump. And so the 6 electors are then to vote for Donald Trump in the Electoral College. Some states will allow their electoral votes to be divided. For example, if a state had a very close popular vote, now I'm just using this example off the top of my head and I'm making it up. I don't know if this happened for this particular state. But let's say a big state like Texas with 28 electoral votes. Let's say, and we'll just say years ago in some election, they had a 55% vote for a candidate for president. Let's just use Lyndon Johnson, who was a Texan in the '64 election. And he won. He was Kennedy's vice president. He became president when Kennedy was assassinated in '63. Then he ran again in '64 and became president. So let's just say, and I don't know if this is true or not, but let's say Texas voted 55% for Lyndon and 45% for the Democrat, or for the Republican, excuse me, because Lyndon was a Democrat. Texas, their government could have told their electoral voters, okay, out of the 28 electoral votes, we're going to give 16 to Lyndon, and we're going to give 12 to the other guy to reflect that 55 to 45%. So what we see here is this is how someone like Hillary Clinton in 2016, she had more votes in the popular vote. In other words, more American citizens voted for Hillary than for Donald Trump, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College. So therefore he became president. Many people want to do away with the Electoral College because of this very thing. But what the Electoral College does is it basically protects the smaller states like Oklahoma, Montana, the states with small populations that have a lot less electoral votes. It protects these states from basically being ruled every election by the East Coast and West Coast, where you have a lot of electoral votes. But read that section. I gave you a little bit more details, but I know a lot of people, they don't understand the Electoral College. And they think their vote doesn't count, but your vote still does count. Any questions? Throughout the history of our nation, there have been influences that have basically worked to give the people more power under the Constitution. In other words, these movements have kind of moved our government more to, you know how we said we want to avoid extremes in a republic? Well, there's been some movements that have, so let's say our country's right here in the middle. Over here is complete rule by the people. Over here is rule by a king and a few people. So we're in the middle. We want as many people as possible to be a part of the government without it being a mob. So there's been a couple of movements that have moved our government more in this direction, but not all the way to the extreme. These three things are dealt with on pages 52 through 54. Actually 52 through 50, I believe 56, yeah. I'll quickly summarize them so you can just read about them. But Jefferson was for basically smaller government. He kind of was an anti-federalist. So he was afraid of a big, strong central government. He wanted, especially he wanted more of the agricultural population to be involved in the government. Jefferson also wanted our cities. Jefferson would not want big metropolis cities. He would rather have small rural communities with farmers and planters. And with more of these small community people that weren't as educated as the plantation owners and the wealthy, it would be a much better representative government. Because at first our government started out as a kind of a watered down version of England. We still had, starting with the Articles and then moving into the Constitution, we still had a group that was kind of a mirror of Parliament in England. Parliament was made up of two houses, the House of Nobles, which would have been the rich group in England, and then the House of Commons, which was made up of the common people. Our Congress, initially it started out as just a one house Congress in the Articles of Confederation, where every state gets one vote. But under the Constitution, we had two houses, and it wasn't exactly like Parliament. We had a Congress, we had a Senate, and we had the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, we did kind of mirror the House of Nobles or the House of Lords. You had more of the richer, or I don't think richer is good grammar. We had more of the wealthier elites and plantation owners serving in the Senate. So Jefferson feared this larger central government being more being run by the educated elite citizens who would not consider the common people, the farmers and the planters, as much. Matter of fact, this group here would look at themselves more as a we are the ones who are qualified to be in the government, and you folks in the lower classes will just have to defer to our education, our expertise. And Jefferson, even though being an educated man, being a fairly wealthy man, he advocated for the farmers. And so he won the election in 1800, and he called it a revolution because he followed John Adams, who followed Washington, and John Adams did favor kind of an elitist government. So the Jeffersonian democracy went along for about 28 years, and then Andrew Jackson became president. And so we're talking about how our government moved more to this end. So Jefferson kind of moved it to where Congress was more diverse with both the rich and the common people. When Jackson came in, he looked at the presidency as an office that was for all the people. And so he wanted to form a stronger link between the common people and the presidency. So he used his authority as president to do some major changes. He though wanted a stronger central government where the executive or the president was connected more directly to the people. He wanted all eligible white males to be able to vote. And so the power, the influence of the common people would increase. even more so than Jefferson's Jeffersonian democracy. The third kind of shift came with the progressive era, beginning in the 1900s, with our manly man president, Theodore Roosevelt. And they passed some things you'll see there on the bottom of page 53 into page 55, where it made it more of a direct democracy. They made it to where the progressives allowed for initiative and referendum. That's at the bottom of page 53. And what that simply means is, with the initiative, citizens in a state, if they got enough people to sign a petition, they could get something on the ballot for people to vote on. For example, if they wanted to pass a new law, they would get people to sign a petition and then it would be put on the ballot. Referendum is where they would get enough people to sign a petition to where they would get rid of a law. And so there's a very detailed table on page 54 that shows you how it is in each state. An example here in Oklahoma is after we passed medical marijuana being legal, I think that was 2016, wasn't it? After that passed, there was talk about now the people who own marijuana farms and the people who have medical marijuana, and then the citizens who want marijuana, they're going to get it put on the 2018 ballot that we pass recreational marijuana, which I don't think they got enough signatures to do that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to try to do it again in a couple of months. Any questions as we move to chapter 3? All righty, I'm going to just do a couple of things here so we can get out in 5 minutes and give you 10 more minutes for the day. This chapter is about federalism. Specifically, when we talk about federalism, we want to understand it as a division of power. Our founding fathers who framed the Constitution believed that government power must be divided and limited so that individual freedom is not threatened. With our form of federalism, there was 2 basic levels of government, and that would be federal level and state level. Now, when we think about government power and authority, federalism was very, very scarce before our Constitution and our government was put in place. Usually, or I should say, almost always, a government of a country would be absolutely sovereign. That is, their power would be indivisible. With federalism, remember, power is divisible. That is, it's divided. But before that, power was sovereignty solely rested with whoever was the supreme authority, whether it was a king or a queen, or if it was a royal family, whether it was a dictator, or if it was a small group of military generals, or another small group that had power, which we would call an oligarchy. They would have supreme power. There was no dividing of authority. So with federalism and with our Constitution, we do have a division of powers, and we have already touched upon, but we're going to go more in depth starting on Monday. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which gives the federal government clear powers or expressed powers. In other words, these are powers that are specifically given in the Constitution to the federal government. Now remember, we had a Bill of Rights that was added to the Constitution. One of the primary concerns was individual liberty, but also the 10th Amendment protected state sovereignty. So the 10th Amendment makes sure that the federal government does not completely overrun the state governments. And the reason this is because when the Constitution was written, we already had 13 state governments. And we had the Articles of Confederation, which basically made the states supreme. So our 13 original colonies were not going to give up the power that they enjoyed outright. So the Constitution made sure, especially with the 10th Amendment, that there were powers reserved only for the states. The federal government could not tell the states what to do concerning education or how they did their law enforcement or their policing, things like that. So there are expressed powers for the federal government. There are reserved powers for the state government. And then there are implied powers to the federal government, which basically says that the federal government can pass laws that are necessary and proper for the functioning of the country. So that's where we're going to pick up on Monday. Any questions? All right, well, have a great weekend. I will be gone next Friday, so I will have a video or some kind of article. So if you need to make plans for anything else during this hour, you have a week's notice to do that, but I'll remind you.